Good afternoon. Welcome to today's first afternoon session. I'm Mautner from this law faculty. We have two speakers this afternoon, Professor David Head and Dr. Yuval Eylon. I'll present them now and then leave the floor to the two of them. So David Head is the Chaim Perelman Professor of Philosophy at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He earned his PhD in philosophy at Oxford University, Wadham College. He has been teaching at Hebrew University since 1976, serving for some time as head of the philosophy department and as director of the university program for outstanding students, Amirim, the equivalent of the local Lautman program at Tel Aviv. David's main areas of research in which he has published many books and articles are ethics, political philosophy, and bioethics. He has served on many public committees on biomedical issues, leading to regulation and legislation of medical practice in the fields of procreation, genetics, and euthanasia. David Head was teacher, fellow, and visiting scholar in many departments of philosophy in the world, including those of Harvard, Berkeley, Columbia, and Princeton. And now I want to introduce Dr. Yuval Eylon. Yuval is senior lecturer at the Department of Philosophy of the Open University. His main fields of interest are ethics and metaethics. Yuval earned his PhD in philosophy at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in 2003 under the supervision of Professor Avishai Margalit. He received many awards for his academic achievements, including the Yael Cohen Award for Exceptional Research in Philosophy and the Nathan Rothenstreich Scholarship for Outstanding Graduate Students at the Department of Philosophy at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Yuval published many articles in journals in Israel and abroad, among others in Philosophy and Literature, the Virginia Law Review with Alon Arel for the lawyers among us, and in Philosophy and Phenomenological Research with David Head. So David, please.
You shouldn't have disclosed that secret now. Now they know. And he didn't mention the subject of our common article.
Which was unflattering.
Flattery.
Flattering, one word.
The first and only philosophical article on the subject of flattery.
Well, having read this one full page, I intentionally omitted the topic.
Thank you, Manny, and thank you, Chagai, and thank you, Shai. The only affiliation which many missed was my affiliation to the Safra Center for Ethics, and for that I'm grateful to Shai. I've been here for now the third year, and it's really a pleasure. I'm going to start with a radical thought experiment, which goes even more radical than Joanna's career preservation fantasies yesterday. As those of you have read the written version of that paper, I start with the 1977 launching of the spacecraft Voyager 1, with the mission of investigating the solar system, and once it completed its scientific mission, the NASA researchers knew that it would go on more or less indefinitely into outer space, and last year it indeed reached, after 37 years, the heliosphere, that outer reaches of the impact of the sun, and now is going to move in interstellar space. Today, after 38 years, it's at the speed of 60,000 kilometers per hour. It has reached the distance of about 36 hours. It gets 36 hours for an electronic or radio message sent from Earth to the spacecraft to get back. So it's about 20 billion kilometers, which is something we cannot conceive of, and is by far the man-made object which is farthest away from Earth. And I was fascinated, always philosophically fascinated, when I read one of the NASA scientists' comment that Voyager, I'm quoting, is destined perhaps eternally to wander the Milky Way. I began fantasizing about the theoretical possibility that it could not only outlast the existence of humanity as a species, that is to say evolutionary time, but also in more astronomical time, the existence of the very solar system. So in 4.5 billion years' time, the sun is going to destroy or consume itself, and so the whole, and of course it would mean the end of the planet, our planet Earth, and that might be the time in which still Voyager 1 wanders somewhere between the galaxy, the Milky Way, the stars of the Milky Way. Now, Carl Sagan, the famous scientist who was called or invited to create a golden record, which was inserted or put into that Voyager 1 spacecraft, he decided on a list of humanity's achievements, expressions of humanity's achievements, like some Bach fugues and the Beatles and pictures of the anatomy of human being, and some, I don't know, Leonardo da Vinci, all kinds of traces and marks to be left for posterity, if you like, but so that we could at least fantasize about leaving some trace or a mark. Now, what could be the chance of some intelligent beings ever finding that spacecraft and Carl Sagan's record on it is very difficult to assess. It's infinitesimal in my view, and of course it's even a smaller chance that any intelligent being would be able to decipher the content of the information on that golden record. So the question which I want to raise in this paper is, can we conserve or preserve something with no addressee? Is there any meaning of leaving a trace or a mark when no one can reach it or read it if it reaches, if it has access to it? Now, still it has, I believe, a very deep symbolic function, and I think Carl Sagan was a very sane and balanced scientist, was aware of that desperate gesture of effort to leave some such mark. Now, it was exciting for me while working on this paper a few months ago to find out that in the prologue to The Human Condition, Hannah Arendt recounts very similar experience. In 1957, 20 years before the launching of Voyager 2, the first first Sputnik was launched by the Russians, and to quote Hannah Arendt, has been admitted tentatively to the sublime company of the heavenly bodies. It was, in her words, an event, I quote again, second in importance to no other. So Hannah Arendt is no less dramatic than my own way of portraying my personal fascination with Voyager 1. She says that it's a kind of effort of human beings to escape the very human condition. In her case, it's the physical gravity. But also, which is more relevant to our conference, also the association with other living animals. So this is the way, both Voyager 1 and the first Sputnik in Hannah Arendt's case, to sharpen the line between human beings and other living animals. Now, Voyager 1 has managed to escape not only from the force of gravity, which is imprisoning, in Arendt's terms, humans to planet Earth, but to run away altogether from the solar system. But Sagan's vision was not so much concerned with escaping from the human condition, but rather to preserve some signs of humanity probably after it is gone. And as Arendt says, action means leaving a mark in the world. The philosophical question I want to raise is, can a mark have no addressee, as I mentioned a moment ago, and would it make any sense if those who experience or see that mark can get the message in sense of understanding it? That's what I was referring to in one of our discussions yesterday, what I call the intelligibility gap, that even if we retain in cryopreservation human tissues, and some researchers in 1,000 years' time try to make some use of it, we have no idea. We cannot even try to predict the kind of use or the interpretation they're going to make out of it. So that should, in a way, I think, affect our motivation or the sense, meaning we are giving to such an attempt. So that's the first stage of fantasy and speculation. Now to more philosophical, solid philosophical distinctions. This is, I think, for me, in bio-preservation or conservation is a very interesting test case for a theory of value in general. What is the nature of value? What are the conditions of something being of a value? Now, what I want to submit to you as a thesis is that, as I call it in the paper, there are no values without valuers, in the sense that values, unlike truth, value is something which is dependent on the existence of people who can appreciate that value, give meaning or evaluate or assess or appreciate that value. Now, that does not apply, in my view, to truth. I mean, truth has been there for facts of the matter, if you like, before there were any human beings, before the evolution of human beings or the creation of human beings. But value, I want to contest that idea that there was value in the physical or natural world before the existence of human beings, or at least some forms of higher animals that we might also add into that group of what I call valuers. So value is always some value for someone. Good is something which is good for someone, and this someone must be actual. It must be someone who actually can assess or can be ascribed with this value. And in that respect, it has to do with the interests, rights, ideals, pleasure and pain, sense of pleasure and pain, welfare, etc. Now, these are usually ascribed only to human beings. Maybe, again, if we speak about pleasure and pain, then some animals, of course, join that group. And if that is the case, then we are talking about what Derek Parfit, the Oxford philosopher, has called a person-affecting theory of value. Value is something which affects persons. Now, in contrast to the person-affecting view, the alternative is the much more traditional historical philosophical view which is called impersonal view of value, according to which value may be attached to the world, not necessarily to human beings or via human beings who are affected by that value. So according to impersonal theories of value, something can be good tout court, as we would say in French, good in itself, good full stop. That is to say, we may say that beautiful things or things are beautiful even if there's no one in the world who can appreciate that beauty. So a landscape can be beautiful, or an animal can be beautiful, or anything can be beautiful without any living being or who has any power to appreciate the value of that beautiful thing. So, for example, Leonardo's Mona Lisa remains beautiful even if there are no creatures having eyes to be able to appreciate the beauty of this piece of art. Now, this is the alternative impersonal view of value, and I presented it in a very condensed and concise way. Of course, the two theories are highly developed by philosophers, but I want it as a background to our general discussion of the value of preservation and conservation, because I think these are test cases, on the one hand, for the validity of either this or that theory of value on the one hand, but on the other hand, I mean, adopting one particular theory of value like I'm doing by adopting the person-affecting view, I can assess the claims of the value of conservation on a certain basis rather than another. So, for example, as I said, I don't believe that the Mona Lisa has any aesthetic value or any value at all if there are no human beings any longer in the world. So in that respect, the imaginary case of which I'll mention again shortly, of the last man on Earth, last man on the planet, I mean, if this last man decides to tear up or to burn the Mona Lisa before committing suicide or before dying himself, then I think there's nothing we can say, morally speaking, or from a value point of view, about this action, because the preservation or the conservation of the Mona Lisa in a humanless world doesn't have any meaning. In that sense, the person-affecting view has certain conditions of the very applicability of the concept of value. Value is not that the world is worse without human beings or better with human beings, but without human beings, value just does not apply. Value does not apply, and we have nothing to regret about the world having been here for 13 billion of years. I mean, the universe, and only in the last million years or whatever, depending how you start to count the existence of human being, all of a sudden became having value. I mean, the world doesn't gain any value from the creation of human beings. It just creates the conditions in which value, the notion of good and bad, are applicable. I want to emphasize that this does not mean that there's no place for objective or intrinsic values. Objective and intrinsic values are possible within that person-affecting framework, because we can say that, killing children is something bad, objectively speaking, although its badness has to do, or the application of this very judgment is possible only when there are children or when there are human beings. And the same may be applied to the Mona Lisa, or even to, according to some people, to the existence of certain species, the continuation of the existence of certain species. So we say that this species is of parrots, of panda bears, or whatever, or smelt fish, is intrinsically good because we think it's beautiful, or it's interesting, or it's illuminating, or it's inspiring, but it's always only for human beings. So once there are no human beings, I mean, this conservation or preservation doesn't make sense. So that explains the title of my paper, Conservation for Whom? To Whom? So let's skip a little and introduce the idea of guardianship, which is well known, plays a very important role in environmental philosophy. And I want to say that there are, from the biblical first two chapters and the two versions of the creation of humanity and the role of human beings versus nature, has two stories in the first two chapters of the Bible. I won't go into detail here, but I want to remind you there's a famous advertisement of the watchmaker Philippe Patek, which says you never actually own a Patek Philippe, you merely look after it for the next generation. You know, you see a father and a child. It is universal also in Israeli newspapers, you know, so it's not yours at all. It's just for you. You are the guardian of this most precious piece for posterity. This is one kind of custody or guardianship. The other is the legal concept commonly associated with the care of children, and in this sense of custody, the beneficiary of the guardianship is not some third party for whose sake an object is kept, but an independent subject, someone or something which is valuable in itself. So these are two different models of what we conceive of in the concept of guardianship, the Patek Philippe and the custody of a child. Now, this applies also to the environment, because there are the shallow, so-called shallow ecologists. You all know the distinction from the 70s, I think, already, who believe that habitats in general and species and in particular have value because they serve human purposes of all sorts, utilitarian, epistemological, aesthetic, etc. And therefore, we have to guard for the next generation these objects, species, habitats, whatever, so as our descendants can enjoy them like that precious watch. This is a perfectly understandable, to me, anthropocentric view of the value of preservation. And it can be very wide-ranging. It doesn't have to be utilitarian or exploitative. It can involve respect to nature, to its inner beauty, to its intrinsic values of whatever kind we find in them. The alternative environmental philosophy, or that of deep ecology, interprets the responsibility of guardianship underlying the duty of preservation in a different way. It is like the custody of an orphaned child. The value lies in nature itself, in the species itself, in the fish or in the ecosystem, rather in the way future generations of human beings are going to derive satisfaction, interest, knowledge, utility from those natural items. Now, how deep does the value of natural environment goes is a matter of controversy, but I think, it may involve the species, individuals, species, ecosystems, and indeed the planet as a whole, like in the James Lovelock's famous Gaia hypothesis. Now, a word about nature versus culture, and human culture, because I think we have to think about that carefully. I want to say that, well, planet Earth has undergone major catastrophes in its history, like ice ages, meteorites, some of them much more catastrophic or calamitous changes than those which are caused nowadays and in the near future by human beings, like climate, anthropogenic climate change. So we should try to understand whether or why it is considered more of a tragedy or a disaster in some impersonal sense that the catastrophes brought by human beings in comparison to those which naturally occurred in the history of the planet before or after the evolution of human beings. I don't think it's an easy question to answer, because again, if human beings are natural creatures, then if they are natural creatures, they are part of that game, and the way we treat the planet is part of its natural evolution, including the catastrophes or the major changes in it. If we are, on the other hand, considered responsible, we are not considered just natural parts of that world. We have culture, we have values, we have responsibilities. We are custodians, for example. Then we are out of nature, and in that respect, that involves also a certain anthropocentric or different way of considering the value of nature versus the value of human beings, of human interests. So one of the most widespread arguments for the conservation of species is based on the distinction between the natural and the artificial, between spontaneous evolution and designed human transformation of natural species. And this has been one of the main tenets of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's philosophy, for example, and his deep suspicion of the arts and the sciences, and indeed of civilization in general. Contrived intervention in the natural order is intrinsically wrong according to that view. However, beyond the legitimate debate about the appropriateness of deep interference with natural processes, we must not ignore that the very distinction between the natural and the artificial, and particularly the way it is drawn, is itself a cultural construction rather than a natural fact. And I mean cultural not in the anthropological or relativistic sense, but in the sense of being the product of rational or theoretical human concepts. So in that respect, I mean, we cannot just speak in terms of what is natural for the world to be in and our responsibility to maintain it, because the very idea of natural landscape or species or ecosystems is in itself humanly constructed by science, human interests, ideals, values, etc., and cannot appeal to something in the world in the natural sense. Okay, I have to skip it quite a lot. There's one way to try to justify the preservation of the species and the tragedy or the catastrophe of extinction, and that has been developed by Ronald Dworkin, for example, who looks at the natural world both biological and physical, as the product of a very long evolutionary process. And Dworkin says it's crazy if we destroy with one blow or one bomb, the Grand Canyon, because it has taken so many millions of years to this beautiful thing to be created that it would be a shame, it would be a pity if we destroyed it. Now, I think there's a kind of fallacy which we should consider in the analogy between the achievement of human effort, in a cultural or in human action, in leaving a heritage or a legacy, and the natural process of the world, the physical or the biological world, which has no intention or no design behind it, and hence cannot be referred to in terms of achievement or nostalgia or legacy. Now, I think we were talking yesterday about the temporality and the subtle relationship between past, present, and future. I think there's a lot of nostalgia deeply underlying the way we treat the natural environment and the natural species when we come to the considerations or the debates about their conservation, because nostalgia is by definition an unrealistic aspiration of turning the clock back usually to our childhood, which is something which is irretrievable, and even had it been retrievable, it would have looked to us different than it actually was. So I think there's preservation, if one may use the term oxymoronically, is a future-oriented nostalgia. It's like that designed or planned hindsight, to attempt to return home in time which lies beyond our access, like our childhood. So let me just wind up by saying that I think it's interesting that, back to Voyager 1, fantasy, which captures my imagination, and I cannot deny its force. But nevertheless, I resist its power because I think it's irrational. And I think it's irrational. Maybe Carl Sagan's The Golden Record did not involve so much investment of money, but had it cost millions and millions, I would have opposed it, despite the nice fantasy about it. The fantasy is self-transcendence, is trying to live beyond our existence or the human condition, and trying to leave a trace in a world in which there's no addressee or no one to notice that trace. And in that respect, we are definitely, I think, the only creatures in the world who have this power of self-transcendence or self-transcendent imagination, which is a kind of bootstrapping. It is not rational in the strict sense, but it does express our attempt to fight death, to struggle with the idea of our personal and species prospect of extinction, which will happen one day, whatever preservation strategies we take to preserve animals, let alone our own species. Thank you.
Okay, try and be really brief. Try and be quick. As the subject of the paper we wrote together is flattery, and one of our obvious claims is that one can flatter using the truth. So thank you for a terrific paper. David, as he sets out, tries to do a couple of things in this paper. One is criticize what he calls the deep ecological or impersonal conception of value concerning biodiversity preservation. And the second is to make a more general claim in the theory of value and defend the personal position, the personalist view, which says that values in some sense depend on valuers. A claim, a rather grand claim, although one that is often discussed. There are several models or several ways of viewing the possible relation between value and valuers. The simplest would be to say that valuers are the source of value. For example, that something is beautiful because I find it beautiful, right? But there are other models which allow more for the objective and intrinsic values, which David does not want to abandon on this, in light of this dependence. The basic analogy or model, or models maybe in the plural, for this relation is the relation between perceivers and secondary qualities. In other words, the relation between persons and qualities such as color. Dispositional qualities, or according to one view at least, dispositional qualities. The idea is that something is red, for example. Being red, the quality of being red, is something that is internally and inherently related to our sort of perceptual apparatus and the way in which we perceive colors. Nevertheless, it is a property of an object. It does not depend on us. We do not make the object red. We do not paint it. It is there, and what it is disposed to make us view it as red, right? It has some sort of something in its composition or something in it, being red ultimately, is such that in normal conditions, normal observers will view it as red. It will appear red in normal light to normally sighted people, right? So in this sense, secondary qualities such as colors are tailored in a certain way, are made, are not complete without perceivers, right? They're designed, they're dispositions of the object, dispositions that make perceivers react in certain ways. Similarly, or analogously, we can view values as something that moves or appeals or is apprehended by certain types of valuers. In other words, there is the Mona Lisa is disposed to make the observer find it beautiful, right? That is what being beautiful is. It is a disposition of the painting, in this case, to elicit a certain type of response from aesthetically astute or sufficiently astute viewers. So this, in general, would be a model for... now, this is an object... The way I put it is a rather realist way of viewing these properties. And one question I think that has to be put to David concerning his thought experiment is how objectivist are you willing to go? I'll return to that problem later, I think, but your suggestion, for example, that it is fine to burn the Mona Lisa knowing that the next thing that will happen will be your demise as the last person on Earth, does not necessarily square with the idea that the Mona Lisa is objectively beautiful, even though its beauty resides in the fact that it is such a quality. I'll come back to that in a moment. So that is one general, I think, clarification that is required about the relation between valuers and values. A second point I want to make is that the impersonalist, strangely, finds herself in a position in which much of David's criticism, although unsettling, is not surprising. Right? If we think of values as something that is out there and is independent of the kinds of creatures we are, of the way we value things, of the way we live, of our interests and desires and wants and rights, and everything about us, it is quite conceivable that it will be very difficult for us to justify and explicate why something has value. In other words, the more realist you are, the more impersonal values are, the more of a mystery it is, of course, how values are given to us. And the corollary of that is that there is a difficulty in justifying in terms that do not really, how do you want me to, right? Either in some sense, now this is a problem, of course, that haunts realists of all sorts in every realm of discourse, but it's fair game. So it's not necessarily very upsetting to find out, well, I cannot defend, let's say, the value of biodiversity in a way that does not appeal to human sensitivities and to why it's important to biologists or to people who love nature or something like that. But that's because I'm just bound by the kind of creature that I am. Nevertheless, I think that being valuable to us might be an indication of being valuable per se or valuable to the court, because that is the kind of metanormative position that I hold about values, supposedly. So that, I think, in that sense, I don't think it detracts completely from the argument. It just says that it's limited in some sense, that the impersonalist might bite the bullet and say, yes, you know,
Yes, what?
Yes, it's difficult to justify in terms that do not relate. Okay, and where am I on the time scale? Almost. Okay, so one last quick point, returning perhaps to the subjectivist, objectivist sort of fork or dilemma. Utifero's famous problem in the dialogue, in Plato's dialogue bearing that name, is the issue, are things valuable because we value them, or do we value them because they're valuable, right? Is something valuable because the gods decreed so, or do the gods say so because it is valuable? Now, when we ask about biodiversity or something like that, I think the question rises, again, on the one hand, on the subjectivist horn of the dilemma, the fact that many people here and many other people think that biodiversity is of value seems to suggest in itself, right, that it is, in a sense, valuable. It makes their life better. You would be very bitterly disappointed if the fish were to become extinct or something of that kind. It does have a role in people's life, and that is enough to endow it with value. On the other hand, when you move away and say, no, it has to be valuable, it's not enough what people actually value. It's what people ought to value, what is actually valuable and have a normative element. Then disenchantment becomes dangerous, because everything valuable, everything we value can be naturalized and described in a way that renders it pointless and ridiculous. This is true. The late Israeli philosopher Yeshayahu Leibovich said about football, that is a strange game in which 11 players chase a ball. If they want it, why do they kick it? If they don't want it, why do they chase it? Now, the same type of description, right, can be applied across the board. Aristophanes in Plato's in Plato describes erotic love as a sort of bizarre exercise of creatures cut in half who are trying to find their other half in a sort of, and it's easy to go through, music is nothing, the Mona Lisa is but paint, splashes of paint on a canvas, and why should anybody? So the disenchantment is a double-edged sword, and the question is, how can you stop it? How do you stop the regress? If you say that biodiversity can be described, or in a way in which guardianship and so forth don't count, why can't the same happen to the value of music?
Of
music or love or...
Well, thank you very much, Yuval.
David, we'll take comments from participants, and then we'll have the last word. Okay?
Yeah.
So thanks for David and for Yuval, and let's take some comments from yes, please.
David, you said at the end explicitly, so you are excited by this idea of putting all the valuables in a spaceship and letting it go. But you said it wasn't rational, so you are trying to resist this temptation. You said, I think,
yes.
You are tempted. Could you say more about, so what's so irrational about that, for example, that temptation? And specifically, why is it more rational to think that Why is the idea that anything that is valuable has to be valuable for someone? Why is it more rational than things being valuable in themselves, or whatever the opposite is? I mean, the idea itself, something being valuable for me, for people, that's not an obvious idea either. So I value something and it becomes valuable suddenly, that's not also...
No, I didn't say that.
But you are saying it's more rational than the...
Not true. The fact that you value something that is good for you doesn't make it valuable.
No, it makes it valuable for
the
me.
condition, you can say that something is valuable regardless of how it affects you,
Yes.
but it must be, the value is conditioned by the fact that some people are affected by it.
Why is it more rational than that?
Well, that's the way I conceive of values, because I think that it goes back to the first part of your question of what makes it irrational to, because, well, I'll start from what fascinates me, and maybe that is the value of Carl Sagan's attempt, which is giving us some inspiring, philosophically inspiring thought experiment. That's enough to make that a particular action valuable. So from the point of view of how NASA or this particular scientist designed that record, that's okay with me. It's person affecting. It affects me. Here I'm using it in a productive, I hope, way as a basis for discussion on a philosophical level. But beyond that, I'm going back to the absurdity, in my view, the absurdity of having a living or giving meaning to some trace that or mark that you leave in, for which there's no one who is able to give it meaning. So our whole idea of legacy, for example, or heritage, or leaving some mark in the world has to do with the way that it's going to be transmitted to someone. I mean, the fact that you leave a certain mark on a stone somewhere in the desert doesn't mean anything unless it is transmitted or conveyed to someone. And so is a creation of a work of art. It can be meaningful to you, you can derive satisfaction from doing the Mona Lisa, the act of creating the art. That could make you very satisfied, and that's enough to make it a person affecting, valuable in terms of a person affecting. But if you believe that there's something beyond that that is worth preserving, conserving, maintaining, then I believe the conditions of such valuation has to do with addressees.
I want to put a jarring note into your presentation. And it says something about how Aaron to come up with the way she looks at Sputnik. The reality of Sputnik was the Cold War in how the United States. But the other side is there is another vision than the one that you give, and you alluded to it in terms of evolution. Take after Sputnik and after atomic bomb, you have a vision on the part of various people, Dyson, O'Neill, and various people, of escaping the world. Dyson spends 2-3 years actually developing a spacecraft by which to propagate himself by detonating atomic bombs, and a vision really of escaping our planets, eventually populating the world, etc., and a real and designing spaceship, and it may well become a reality. In other words, there are visions whereby eventually you will have not the species as we know it, But intelligence, especially if it's an accelerating, expanding universe, Dyson has written down how can you preserve intelligence in that. And the vision is, right, I mean, the vision is actually, right, that's, you can take planets apart on how to conserve yourself, etc., etc. Where the species, or where we are different, is I think we are the first species that indeed consciously can affect the history of the planet, of the solar system, and therefore that's something new, okay, and makes it very special in terms of our species. And then it comes back to your question, what is our responsibility given that? Because in some sense we have created all this meaning and these attributing values, okay? I mean, there's clearly value to a previous species in eating something in order to reproduce and survive, etc. So, but we are the first ones that can change the history of the universe. And that's something very special in terms of, at least...
I agree, but I'll...
David, with your permission, because of the brevity of time, let's take two questions at a time, and then you'll respond. Okay?
Very good.
Shai. Okay.
So mine is a follow-up on Sam, but from a different direction. So David, I think you're creating a false opposition, and you're saying we need to choose either or. Either it's about nature or it's about human related. And I think that the Sagan in that example is not very helpful because it also pushes in that direction. I'm not sure whether deep ecology falls exactly the way you put it, but I'll assume that it does. But then still, I think that we need to insist that there's a third possibility that doesn't exist in the paper. Although I found the paper very helpful in thinking through these questions. So it might be that it is important for humans to maintain the distinction between what is human and what is natural. That is, that it's important for humans that not everything is human related in this way. So that the distinction between the natural or the given and the human is neither artificial nor is it natural, but it's rather the basis for this very distinction. You can't say about it that it's either one or the other, because the distinction between the natural and the human is itself constitutive to the human condition. And the reason why this is, I think, important for the discussion, because a lot of this has to do with the fact that we are, as humans, concerned with the fact that nature, as such, is disappearing or is becoming in some way extinct. And I think that, so just to add another twist to this, I don't think in the final analysis, and I wonder what other people think about this, but I don't think that in the final analysis we actually care about this species or that species, about this this ecosystem or that ecosystem. I think that underlying all these concerns with is actually a more fundamental notion, or a foundational notion, that something has gone wrong or is very different than it used to be. It's not necessarily negative, but it's very different from the way it used to be. And what is the difference is that now we can't think of anything as natural anymore, because a lot of it has become human produced. And the mourning and the sense of loss that comes with it is the sense of loss is precisely this categorical distinction. I think that that's part of Hannah Arendt's point on the human condition. Now, whether this is bad or not is an open question, but mourning, I think, is in place in the sense that, people die. That's, and history's changed, and the human condition possibly is also under transformation. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say that it's bad, but I certainly could see why people experience it as a certain kind of a loss. It doesn't mean that there's something particular that we need to do against it, but I can empathize with this notion of mourning that accompanies it.
That's what I call nostalgia.
Yeah, I know.
You agree that you would share that?
But you say that this nostalgia is is a philosophical impossibility, right? In some sense.
I thought you admitted.
No, I actually tried to create a third possibility that is philosophically groundable. Okay, but maybe.
I'm not sure, but we should go on with that, because I'm not sure I got the point. But let me be very brief in responding to to Yuval. First of all, thank you very much for
with your permission, one more question.
One more question. Okay.
Please, yes, and then, okay.
Okay. You?
I had one question about the argument of the last man
Yes.
who can destroy the Mona Lisa.
Yes.
So first there is a whole history of the conservation of the Mona Lisa that this last man should know.
Should what?
Should know. I mean, it depends if he knows it or not, but the Mona Lisa has been at risk of being destroyed many times in
Yes.
history. Yeah.
Let's assume that it exists when.
Let's assume that he knows it, and then
Beings around.
and then there's a knowledge of the extinction of the human species. How does he know he is the last man?
Well, it's just an imaginary thought experiment, of course. I mean, this is very artificial, philosophical.
He killed the rest.
He killed the rest, or it's a whole generation which is going to die without having any reproduced any children. I mean, there could be no. It's I don't have any.
It seems very essential to me, these questions of certainty and hope, because they are fundamental presumptions that make these thought experiments even possible to run. But if you
look,
there is epistemological assumptions and assumptions, right? But if you don't make those, and I think it's very hard to make them, to ground them.
I agree. Yeah. The whole point, like in any philosophical thought experiment, is not to give give an account to the way we actually think about a practical matter, but about the principles. I mean, what could be the justification, the normative justification? So in that respect, I mean, the idealized thought experiments are conceptually productive. That's the only thing I say. I've no actual image of how it would look like, as you say, the epistemological conditions and the hopes, etc., for a better world, or maybe there will be somebody out there. But as philosophers, we want to isolate those cases, idealize the choice, just for one reason, to test our intuitions about the ultimate justification, because I'm not against the environmental movement of conservation, all for it. What I want to say is that the justification or the reasoning behind conservation is sometimes different than what some of the environmentalists claim. That has to do with our interests in the long-term interests of human beings. So that's my only claim, and it's really philosophical rather than political. I'm not for destroying the Mona Lisa already now, because anyway the last man will. But I think it should be an interesting case for us that to think about the preciousness of biological species or fish or any other. It's just a matter of time. They're going to be extinct anyway, as we are. I mean, we can make even all the investment and responsibility in the world won't stop the cycle of extinction and replacement of species in evolutionary time, so does it make such a difference that this is in long-term extinction and now we have to take care for the short-term? I don't know. It calls for justification, and my view is that the justification is that in the short term it would serve our descendants' interests. In the large,
now we have 5 minutes to comment on
perceivers and secondary qualities. This, I think, is the most insightful comment, which I'll have to integrate into my argument. I just wanted to remind you that secondary qualities like color and goodness, maybe, as you say, are based on primary qualities, and the primary qualities might have existed forever, and they are neutral in terms of
another argument.
Their color. Okay, their color, and they are neutral in terms of their goodness. In order to become to secondary qualities, at least that's one interpretation, possible interpretation of John Locke. They have to be perceivers or evaluators, in my case. So before the evolution of human beings, I mean, these objects had certain primary qualities which we couldn't say red or good, because they were just certain arrangements of constituent particles. But now that there are such perceivers or appreciators or evaluators, they become a secondary quality. But I still am hesitant about accepting the analogy in full, because I think in the case of goodness, unlike colors, we have some choice. You know, that's the difference. I mean, we can form ideals or values for ourselves rather than just perceive them in the world. So in that respect, I think there's some difference, which is not easy to articulate. Responsibility to the planet or to the universe. I don't think we have such responsibility. I mean, we have responsibility only to human beings, or we have responsibilities to nature only as long as it serves the values of future human beings. But otherwise, I don't think we have any responsibility to evolution to go on the way it went so far.
What is your conception of human beings? We have the ability to change what we mean.
We change. Absolutely. So it includes not only our capacity to change nature or to escape the human condition, but also to change the human conditions, as Shai mentioned. And I think it's not completely new. I mean, civilization in general changed the human condition throughout the history of human evolution, but now it has become more dramatic, more condensed in terms of time.
How does but you're making again a difference between condition and the human. You're assuming that there is something intrinsic and essential about a human being, and that's
no, I don't. That's exactly what I want to deny. That there's no in admitting that human beings can change what human beings are. But I still want to say that conceptually, I mean, we might reach a stage in which we would lose the capacity to evaluate, would become robots rather than human beings. Then I think my philosophical argument would be that we would lose the conditions of being evaluators and therefore for being any value in the world. That's a possibility too, and we can lead to such a condition. With Shai, I'm not sure. We should discuss it further, because I thought I could accept the way you articulate that distinction between the natural given and the spontaneous, to use Kantian terms of freedom or rationality, because I'm very much in sympathy to the Kantian point of view. But I think that's it. This is itself a given. Now, it's itself a given. Kant doesn't deny that human beings, well, he lived before Darwin, but he wouldn't have denied that this duality, Kantian duality, is itself the product of evolutionary processes. I mean, there weren't human beings, there were no rational creatures. Now there are.
Okay, thanks so much for our speakers, and let's meet again at 3 p.m.
Still